It took me a long time to decide what chapter to read to you guys as an example of what the book would be like. Later chapters had too many spoilers in them, they gave too much away. Whereas earlier chapters were so formative, they really didn't tell what the bulk of the novel would feel like when you were reading it. I finally picked this one out. It's kind of in the middle, well, sort of the early middle, so I don't think it'll spoil too much about the plot of the novel. And at the same time, I think it'll give a real good flavor of what you might see. As the morning sun of the third dawn stained the city a peach gold color, Robert Clive's soldiers saw a puzzling sight. Over the city walls appeared the sails of a sailing ship, surrounding a massive canvas balloon. As the hull of our ship appeared, soldiers sounded alarms and ran with rifles to the walls. On the city towers, cannons fired their shots, but our height was greater than they were used to, and their shots fouled back among the city among the troops now swarming the walls. Ophelia's cannons erupted in angry retort, dozens of shots causing the southern tower soldiers to leap into the moat, while turning the northeast tower to dust. Now the Ophelia was high above the southwest wall of the city, and under it hung a huge platform, nearly as big as Ophelia's hull. Her bow dipped, and the ship and platform slipped down toward the city's main open square. A company of 100 British soldiers marched orderly into the square. They were regimented and well-groomed in their blue-gray uniforms, freshly laundered by the women of Arcot, and tall black boots, polished nightly by the orphaned children of the city. They acted unimpressed by our flying ship and raised their rifles towards the platform we carried, awaiting the Indian soldiers they expected to run out. But more than one eyebrow was raised when they actually saw what came out. As the massive timbers of the platform kicked the courtyard's dust into the air, up stood a half a dozen armored elephants. On their brass-plated backs were turbaned soldiers armed with pachyderm-mounted swivel cannons, borrowed from the Ophelia, and even a couple full-sized ship's guns. The massive beasts thundered forward into the British soldiers, scattering their ranks as the swivel guns pounded and crumbled the perches of the snipers on the walls around them. After the elephants left the platform, a dozen ropes dropped from the belly of the Ophelia, and down slid our pirates and myself, pistols tucked into belts, swords strapped to our backs. At this point, our crew had had many months of fighting together, and this attack was old hat to us. As soon as the courtyard's defenses were disturbed enough, we turned our largest beasts towards the gates. These massive gates stood under a huge stone bridge and faced the outside world with 6-inch thick iron plates. But from the inside, our target was simply one large wooden beam that horizontally braced the doors, 2 feet by 3 feet thick. 3 or 4 British soldiers were stationed behind the doors, and each dared no more than a single hurried shot towards the charging armored elephants before fleeing to the small side passageways. To prevent the elephants' ears from the sound of the cannon, each had been packed that morning with clay and cloth. This kept the beasts from rearing up as the massive 10-pounders shot through the wooden beam. Splinters and smoke filled the air as they ran on. Their ear packs also kept the beasts from hearing their master's commands to "Chahar John!" And the gates smashed open as the stunned elephants tripped on the wooden splinters and rolled, crushing their riders and armor. Clive's soldiers stood on the dusty bricks in the doorway, rifles at their shoulders. As the first of the Indians rushed into the doors, their guns went off. Bullets found their mark in the massive shoulders of Chandra's front guard, but that hardly slowed their pace. Their objective was to push back the British guard enough to allow the rest of the army to enter the city. I saw this from the center of the square and gestured to the elephants' riders to come in from behind them. The ground then erupted in front of me, and a group of 5 gray-coated infantry ran in firing at me. I leapt toward a small arched tunnel in the wall and ran into the dark, wet interior. I didn't look back, but in a few minutes I heard them enter the tunnel behind me. There were no turns, only doors that I could not risk the time to check if they were locked. Ahead of me, I could see the green-golden daylight. Soon I burst into the light, and it was as if I'd entered a new world. The sound of gunfire was distant and muted. My feet slipped on hard-packed red mud, and all around me was the lush, thick vegetation. Vines, leaves the size of dinner plates, tree trunks the size of small houses. There was still rifle firing behind me. These guys were determined. They must have noticed I was giving orders and figured I was worth the chase. I stumbled forward, and eventually I found myself running on ancient carved stones. And ahead of me, I saw some nearly falling arches and red stone domes of an old shrine. I ran into the intricately carved building and around a corner to catch my breath. Vines and branches were tearing the place apart, slowly over 100 years. My eyes darted quickly around for a hiding place or a way out, when I noticed an alcove behind me and a large hooded silhouette of a cobra raising angrily out of a crushed pot he'd been sleeping in. At this point, the first of the British soldiers plunged into the hall. The cobra jumped at me, and having been staring right at him, I tried to jump back and tripped. It's a good thing I did. Something about the angle my leg had caught on the fallen bricks threw me to the ground much faster than I could have achieved on my own. The cobra missed me, leapt right onto the soldier. The soldier gave off a scream, and then the startled snake bit him. The soldier brushed off the snake frantically and ran out of the tunnel with a ho, ho, ho! Poor guy, he'd surely died of that bite a lot slower than he would of a bullet in battle. At this point, I noticed a hole in the ceiling above the alcove, and I clambered up. Once on top of the temple, I found myself in a knot of branches and leaves. I crept through them across the rooftops, back the direction I thought the city must be in. An hour later, I found myself back inside the walls and found the battle pretty much over. Daniel had what remained of Robert Clive's forces on their knees at gunpoint. Their rifles had been placed in a cart and was being wheeled out the front gate. Robert Clive himself stood in his luxurious but bloodied uniform, looking disgusted at us all. "How dare you? Some of you even look English. Explain yourself before I have you in irons." I gotta hand it to him. He had balls. "I'll explain," I said. "You think your power has given you immunity. You followed orders perfectly enough to allow yourself to be god of this city. It all worked, as long as you didn't think too much about the monstrous things you were ordered to do. Since the order came from above you, you figured no one would hold you responsible." I leaned in close. "I'll think again." The city of Arcot was returned to the people of India. With this new foothold, Chandra's forces gained size and strength. As the rumor of our attack on Robert Clive's forces spread across India, it seemed to have the effect of uniting the people of India in a way they hadn't been before, and their pride strengthened them. Never again would another force take control of their country. Well, not for a couple 100 years anyway.